You want to get to the undergirding motivations of the character. They are not the enemy in their POV. First thing that I would say is really important when it comes to writing a persona poem is resolution. This talk is going to be how to both create and how to make your persona poems more in-depth and more believable. But this also kind of has some applications when it comes to just in general writing. I know you do some nonfiction writing as well, right? So when it comes to nonfiction, because you actually have to know the person or know, like, kind of get some in depth on like real people, as opposed to like maybe like creating like the person out of nowhere. Just when we're talking about a persona poem is a poem in which the poet speaks through an assumed voice. And one of the reasons that I really love this form of poetry or this genre of poetry is because it's kind of like a cheat code. To be honest, you're kind of hijacking somebody's already existing memory of somebody or something, and you're just taking them through whatever you want them to be feeling or whatever the point of your poem is. And so a lot of times it's like most of the work is already done for you. If I try to tell you something from my perspective, you also have to know me. But if I have to tell you somebody, a perspective from, let's say, somebody from The Lion King, maybe Scar from The Lion King. You've already probably raise your hands if you've seen Lion King. Yes, cool. So you've already saw the movie. So now the only thing that I have to do is try to do something with the character that you already have in mind. So again, it's a little bit of a cheat code. Some of it is a little harder because you have to kind of make it believable, right? You have the memory that somebody has of something, it's already there. So if I try to take you outside of that character, you're gonna know. Wearing somebody else's POV, it kind of initially might sound kind of easy because, again, if you know the character, then you might assume kind of jumping into that skin might be might be easy. It's especially if you're doing like, a movie character, politician, family member, you might assume, hey, I know the subject matter pretty well. Let me just jump right into it. But one of the things, and probably the first thing that I would say is really important when it comes to writing a persona poem is resolution. Now, on the flip side, I also do photography. And resolution is measured in PPI, which is pixels per inch, which essentially just means that, if you have something that has a very low pixel per inch or PPI, then it's going to be kind of a distorted, kind of blurry picture. But if you're dealing with a very high PPI, then you're going to get a very high definition, like 4K, like something that's like really, it almost feels like I'm in that space, high definition. And that's kind of the thing that you're dealing with when you're talking about your persona poems. When you have a very low resolution of your character, you might understand maybe this much, this kind of very surface level, man. Let's say what the people did, that is what you know. But the thing that you really want to get to, especially as a writer, and it actually plays really well with the last talk from Ajane, because one of the things that you're really wanting to do is you want to get to the undergirding motivations of the character. Because if you're going to put on this character's skin, you can't just be like, well, I just know what the person did. You got to know why they would do the things they would do. Let's say if your character is like a cowboy, it's not enough to just know that cowboys wear cowboy hats and cowboy boots, right? But like, what exactly does your character do on maybe a day-to-day basis? What does your character feel about certain things, maybe certain conditions? How did they grow up? And how does that connect with the overall identity of a cowboy, which is your character, right? And I'm sure that, in each of our individual writings, you probably came across like characters or people that you're writing on or writing about, that surface level tension, that you have to really break that to really understand or get to your character, right? And one of the things that it's really hard or really difficult to do this with is when you're attempting to personify or bring characteristics to something that's not necessarily a human. And one of the poets that I love every single time I hear her perform, but also it's a really great example of persona piece is Jamelia Woods. One of the lines that really struck me is pink legs walking around like flamingo sex. I tell you honestly, I've never thought of those words string together in my entire life. Never once. And then, but immediately when the author says it in the poem, it's like, I know what you're talking about. And I shouldn't, but like, because, because you've given the proper context, because you did the work ahead of time and really increasing the resolution of the poem. So I don't want to just make any old sex reference. Like, what is a pigeon going to be thinking in this specificity of a narrative and how they're kind of talking? I did some research actually when it comes to the eyes, and I didn't even know this, but pigeons' eyes actually do change over time. So they're born typically just very dark colored, very dark brown, dark black. And then as they get older, their eyes do change colors and they're like a lighter, like orange green-esque kind of color. And I'm like, can you, like, I can't even fathom thinking, man, how am I going to properly depict maybe the nature of this bird? It's not just this bird maybe in New York that is walking around, but it's also the smog that they're kind of, so it's like, okay, now you kind of get a little bit more, but now not only the physical characteristics that I'm taking on of my persona, this pigeon is also changing. And I'm like, that's not something that you just randomly just throw into a poem. It's something that you've done some actual work or some lived experience in order to drive your poem in that direction. Research is the biggest thing. That way it's not just the offhand poem that you're creating. It is, you have deep enough roots in your poem that you can really create an identity for your character. If you're creating the identity for your character, and then on the other hand, that you've done enough research into this character that you can be like, well, nobody else is maybe thinking of this perspective from this character. Kind of the second half, Scar was right. Understanding character motivations is important. So when I say Mufasa had it coming, clearly if you're like reading that or if you're hearing that, you're thinking like, okay, that's coming from Scar's perspective, right? Because Scar is the primary antagonist in Lion King, but he's only the primary antagonist to certain characters in Lion King, right? If you're Simba, Mufasa, Timon and Pumbaa, the lionesses, like, yeah, he's your primary antagonist. But not to Scar. Scar's not the primary antagonist to himself. He's not thinking, man, like, I just really want to just start offing people and become king, right? His goal, he has other underlying motivations and goals that make Scar to himself not the enemy or not the antagonist in the story. So if you're going to write a poem, a story, or something like that from that person's point of view, it's incredibly important that if you're writing it from that person's point of view, that they're not the enemy in their POV. And that's really, really hard to do because, if you're thinking about somebody that you consider to be bad, that you consider to be, this is the villain in the story, then like you're attaching all your negative emotions to that person or to that image or to that character. And so when you're attaching all those negative emotions, it's like it's really hard to see kind of clearly from that person's point of view. If you had to think of like a bad guy in a story, like maybe in your favorite movie, like who's like kind of the bad guy in your favorite movie? So one of the things that, and like Thanos is, and I didn't think about it for this presentation, but Thanos is actually a really, really good example too. Just because the Infinity War, the Avengers Infinity War, I don't know who all has seen what, but if you do want to kind of look at what it looks like for your antagonist to be viewed as the protagonist in a movie, that is the movie to look at. Because to everybody else, Thanos is absolutely the bad guy in the movie. But as far as watching the movie objectively, Thanos is your character that you're following through that movie. You're the person that has character development, the person that goes through loss and that has gain, the person that eventually suffers but does win at the end. All the entire character analysis and the trajectory of your main character, your main protagonist, the vessel that you're carrying through that movie, it happens through who you know is the bad guy in the movie. The only reason why you know that is because there's like 19 other movies leading up to it that shows you, hey, this guy's actually the bad guy. But they actually stopped and said, hey, to Thanos, he's doing the right thing. And like, that's a really, really important. It's it's brilliant writing, right? Because it's what there's some questions that I would always implore people to ask, like when it comes to them writing their characters. And you ask this of, your persona poems, because when you're going into your persona poems, you want to make sure that you have that. I mean, it's going to be hard because it's really hard to write something that kind of great on that kind of scale just because of what it took in order to get there. But when it comes to like your poems and individual pieces, think, why did your character act in such a way? So whatever your character did, why did your character do it? Why did your character think the things or the way that they did? So it's not just the actions, but again, we're taking it a little small level deeper of why it is that they thought those things. How did they treat other characters and why? So what is in the proximity between your character and other characters? What is that relationship and why is that relationship? And just lastly, in general, what leads the character to those specific kind of character motivations? I think these are things that will really hold your character down, but also make sure that, if somebody is just picking up your writing or just somebody is just listening to you, they're going to not only be able to understand your character, but they can be like, well, a great story is not of a hero versus a villain. A great story is two heroes that they believe they're both heroes, but they believe that they're heroes they're just on the opposite side. And of course, you're going to think that guy's a villain, but they're going to think you're the villain. And that's how the whole thing plays out. Now, the next part is the hardest part when it comes to your character motivations, because if they're dense enough, if your character motivations are dense enough and are honed enough, then what it really creates is probably an audience where you're like, any of these people can be right. And now these are a battle of ideals as opposed to just two superheroes duking it out, right? There are now these ideals that you're struggling with. Black Panther. Does anybody watch Black Panther here in the movie? Okay, great. So in the movie Black Panther, one of the things that we walk away from in the movie is not that, these two, like Killmonger versus T'Challa. You're not just thinking which one of these two guys is, if they duke it out, if they're going to beat the other one, right? Because we kind of got our answer, but they had very similar power sets. Everything was pretty much the same when it comes to the physicality. The thing that they're duking out is the ideals, right? Now, here's the thing. I think Killmonger is absolutely a villain, but it's because my ideals just don't align with what Killmonger's eventual goal was in the comic book universe. The thing that you're dealing with is, hey, are you going to go with this person who their plans are, maybe on their surface, justice for black people around the world, right? Because that's kind of what Killmonger's whole thing was, which is, kind of bringing justice to black people and empowering black people to fight up against all these structures and things like that. And T'Challa's was, well, listen, we need to stay within we are not worried about the rest of the world of black people even. We're just worried about Wakanda in and of itself and kind of containing those, like our citizens and what we're doing. On your end, you're thinking to by the end of the movie or through the course of the film, you're really brought to, man, which one of these ideals is correct, right? Which one of these ideas are correct? It is the actual characters and their motivations that you're debating between. When you have a clearly defined character, when you know how to really understand the characters, is you can do more things with your characters afterwards. It gives you such an incredible and intense versatility, because if I can take Scar and you can put Scar somewhere else and then tell a story of this character that you know through and through, but in this completely separate space. You don't gotta even worry about necessarily the things that they've already done, because that you know, you don't have to necessarily comport the actual events, but if you know this person's mannerisms and you know who this person is, then you can put them in these other scenarios and really kind of create another world.